Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for participating in Friday Forums. That was a fantastic main stage event that has me really excited about this breakout session, which is focused on the topic of leading with equity at work. My name is Dani Baum. My pronouns are she, her, and I work in the University of Utah Human Resource Management team as the recruitment manager. And so I help out all across campus with a lot of our searches and advise on a lot of these EDI questions that come up in search. So again, thank you so much for joining this. I will be facilitating this conversation along with my co-panelist, Dr. Tom Maloney, who's an economist in the Department of Economics, who really focuses on his studies on studying socioeconomic inequalities. And then we also have Neelam Chand, who is the founder and CEO of Shift SLC, which consults on diversity issues with organizations across. She's got great experience in public, private sector, higher education. And, we met briefly yesterday, and I think that we've got a really, interesting mix of experiences that we can share with this group, and we'd love to hear from you. So the structure we discussed was taking the first half of this session to share, what we think about what can be done when it comes to equity at work, starting first from macro level, discussing some historical context, some foundational trends, and then moving into, how we've seen that. Neelam can speak to how this has been translated with the organizations that she consults with and how they approach EDI in their workplace. And then I am excited to share how this maybe translates to smaller everyday functions within organizations such as hiring, which is my specialty. So I will let my co-panelists introduce themselves as they get started. If you have questions, please feel free to hop in the chat and you can jump in there, or we'll be opening things up to questions where you might be able to unmute and dig into some discussion in the later part of this breakout. So let's kick it over to Dr. Maloney. Would you like to get us started?
Sure. Can you hear me? I do. As Dani mentioned, I'm a member of the Department of Economics here in the College of Social and Behavioral Science at the University of Utah. I'm mainly sort of an economic historian, but I focus on topics related to inequality in the long run in the US. I've written a bit on African American economic history, also on immigration and immigrant communities, a little bit on gender inequality in the workplace. And I think to some degree, focusing on sort of historical time periods or events often in the past gives me a little bit of insulation, which maybe makes it easier in a sense to take on these topics. You have a little bit of distance. But one thing I think I've learned, though, and this came up a bit in the earlier discussion today, is of course the degree to which history matters, the degree to which the history of inequality in many different ways shapes inequality in the present. So you really aren't that removed from it. There are legacies that we continue to deal with all the time. So that's kind of one pretty straightforward lesson I think I've learned. And then I would just sort of comment on a couple of other sort of big picture things that I take away from kind of my academic work on inequality, and I think especially racial inequality, which I think inform the way I think about the way these issues play out in the present day. And some of this I'm sure is going to seem pretty naive, but nonetheless, this is how I think about it. One thing that I think I've learned is that, and this will come as no surprise to I think any of you, is that progress is not automatic. Progress is not inevitable. I think that comes as a little bit of a surprise to my students sometimes. I think there is a sense that sometimes that, well, we had Brown versus Board of Education, and we passed civil rights legislation, and we had federal contract compliance, and that's all there, and everything just gets better after that. And the real history in the big picture of racial inequality is very episodic. It's not continuous. There are big gains in, briefly after the Civil War, and then in the late 1800s, and certainly in the aftermath of Plessy versus Ferguson, which established a separate but equal, things get a lot worse. Relative funding of Southern Black schools goes down markedly after that point. into the 30s and 40s. There are big relative gains for African Americans in terms of income in the 1940s during the war. They persist for a while into the 70s, and then things stagnate and maybe get worse. Things get a little better in the 90s, things get worse again later on. So it's not automatic, it's not monotonic, it's not continuous necessarily. It's episodic, and one thing that means to me is that we have to be, always kind of vigilant and attentive to inequalities around us. We can't sort of take things for granted in terms of things getting better because we passed the right legislation 50 years ago. But at the same time, I'd say that I think I've learned that progress is possible. There are certainly episodes of really dramatic change in at least kind of local contexts. I think that there's a big hurdle. You think about sort of African American economic history, you think about the Great Migration to the North, and I think there's a big hurdle for employers and communities in that big demographic change. Some of them are totally resistant. I think in pockets you find new entryways made, and you find people really learning from that. And I think that people can gain experience that promotes equality and equity. At least moves in that direction from gaining experience in the workplace or in their community. It obviously doesn't always happen, but I think it can happen. And legal action, can have very dramatic effects. At least for a time, and at least in some communities. There's famous studies of the Southern textile industry in the mid-1960s. You look at that industry from when it really begins to grow in like the 1890s out to 1964, 65, and it's a very, very, very white industry. I mean, they're just through all this stuff, depression, Second World War, you don't get a lot of change in the racial composition of that industry. Then we have federal contract compliance, we have equal employment opportunity, and you see employment in that African American employment in the industry really take off dramatically. And it creates a sense that maybe there were people ready to do something different, but they couldn't sort of do it alone. In some sense, a coordination by the law was necessary to give people kind of the courage to take these new steps, which frankly were in their interest to do. So I think that certainly progress of certain kinds is possible and has certainly occurred in times and places. Another big lesson that I take is that inequities are very interconnected. Historically, African American workers have done well when workers in general have done well. So in the 1940s, for instance, when in general incomes at the bottom are raised up, that is of benefit to African American labor. That's one way in which they're interconnected. African American economic progress is widely interconnected with sort of the history of labor. When unions have had limited ability to organize, they often adopted racially exclusive strategies and kept Black workers out. When they had greater legal sort of foundation, and for other reasons, they adopted more inclusive strategies. So those things are intertwined. The history of African American economic standing and that of immigrants is deeply intertwined back to the 1920s and restrictive immigrant legislation into the present day. So all these things are interconnected, which makes it very challenging to think about them and work on them. And that kind of leads to the final point, which again is not going to, I think, surprise anyone here, that the workplace inequities, the challenges we face in the workplace are very much, in my view, systemic and not just sort of individual. It's not just a matter of, as I believe came up in the prior panel, persuading particular individuals to be nice or open-minded. I mean, there are ways in which these things are interconnected with the way labor markets work and economies work, and they get reinforced by history and get reinforced by other inequities. And so there's a real sort of systemic kind of challenge that we face. So those are kind of the big lessons that I think.
Dani, you want me to take it over?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you so much. Let's go over to Neelam and let's see, what are you seeing across organizations that you work with?
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen with y'all. Okay. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Okay, cool. Yeah, so as an EDI consultant, I've had the opportunity to speak with organizations across the nation And I've had insights, I've had conversations, I've gained some deeper insights into sort of how these organizations are addressing EDI or equity in the workplace, specifically racial equity. So, so what I did is I put together organization profiles or categories that I want to share with you all of where I see organizations sort of fall in terms of awareness of this work after summer of 2020. So after the murder of George Floyd, after the conversation of racial equity, you know, during a pandemic, what were organizations doing and where did they fail and where did they succeed? So I want to share that with you all. And then I'm curious, as I'm explaining this to you, I am curious at the end of this, I want to ask sort of where you think your organization kind of falls in this sort of categorization that I've kind of put together. And again, this is based off of my observation. It's an oversimplification of where these organizations are at. I fully understand that organizations, the way they're made up, the way they're addressing EDI work is very nuanced. So I want to give you that disclaimer. Okay, so let me do this. All right, so the first on this list is, and I don't know if you see the blue dot here, but the first one is the Detractors. So these are organizations that are very much, that were very much disengaged from the conversation. Anything that had to do with equity, diversity, inclusion, or racial bias or racial inequities. What they felt, some of the attitudes and behavior towards this work was that they felt that it wasn't part of the business. It was a nice to have, but not something that that particular business needed. In fact, there were attitudes of just, you know, thinking about diversity, hiring based off of diversity is lowering the bar or somehow decreasing the quality of the organization. So there's a lot of misconception about what EDI work is about and sort of what the business case is. And I want to say that a lot of organizations didn't necessarily fall into this category as much as there were individuals within the organization that were the detractors. These were the folks that were a small group, right? A small percentage within an organization, but they had a great amount of influence, which then sounded like it was a large voice within an organization. The next one is denial. So denial category were organizations that believed that issues of race and racism and bias existed, but didn't necessarily exist within their organization. Their organization was already at a place where these things were already addressed. And so they didn't need to do any more. Sort of this idea that we've already arrived, you know, kind of to Tom's point that this work is continual, but they were at a place where we've done the work. We've hired women, you know, we're 50% women in our organization, we're done. And then so after the murder of George Floyd and the conversation about race and racism, they felt that they've already done the work, maybe not specific to issues of race, but they've done the work in terms of gender. And so that's all they needed to do. So the next one here is performative. So these are organizations that I consider sort of as crisis managers. So they appear to be aware. And you saw a lot of this come up after post 2020, but they seem to be aware by, you know, posting statements and showing support in social media, black squares, and, you know, and making promises of donations. And so you think that on the surface that they're super committed. These are organizations that are super committed to EDI, that are super committed to racial equity. But what we've seen in the past year is that they made these promises and then they've kind of fallen back on them. Momentum's lost. And these organizations sort of just went back to business as usual. And so a good example of this is that, you know, after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of these organizations made promises to donate funds to the to organizations that aligned with racial equity or combating issues of racism. $65 billion was promised. $65 billion was promised, and today only less than 1% of that has actually been fulfilled. $5 million has been donated. So you know that a lot of organizations were sort of in this performative space where they said they were going to do something but didn't necessarily fulfill it. And then the next one is risk adverse. So you are seeing a lot of this now because there's a lot of conversation around how EDI work and issues of racism and critical race theory. These things are highly politicized. So the risk adverse organizations understand that this work is important, but they don't want to ruffle the feathers within their organization. They don't want to disturb or disrupt the peace within their organization and potentially cause more harm. This is typically driven by the fear of having these uncomfortable conversation or discomfort around issues of race. Or again, just the idea of that this work may be politicized. And there's a bit of a lack of knowledge of what this work is about. And then the next one is socially aware. So these are organizations that are aware of the racial disparities around them, but they're not sure entirely what to do about it. So what they do is they take a lot of time doing a lot of research, gathering information, starting book clubs, doing trainings, like they're doing everything all at once, and it becomes very overwhelming to a point where these socially aware organizations feel very helpless, right? They know all the things that are wrong. They don't know where to start. They don't know what their organization stands for, if it actually aligns with how they personally and individually feel. So things end up kind of halting in that space. And then the next one is active allyship. And so these are organizations that are socially aware and they're ready to dive in this work at all costs. So they are willing to build infrastructure. They're willing to pull resources together so that they can embed this work organizationally and create organizational goals around this. So, what does their policy look like? What does their culture like? And really kind of dive in deep and be prepared for anything that may come up. So they're past risk adverse. They're not worried or concerned about what may come up. They're ready to handle it head on. And then you have sort of the advocates, and I very small percentage of organizations are in this space, but these are organizations that are already built to be activists. They're leading out on this work. They're typically politically engaged, and they are very much tackling systems of inequality. So they are the ones that are leading out on some of these issues. An example of this could be a Ben & Jerry's. I know that comes up a lot in sort of cliche, but Ben & Jerry's, prior to the summer of 2020, a lot of their work has been embedded in activism and sort of calling out some of these inequities. Their products are also aligned with their services and products are also, it's an ice cream shop, but their services and products are aligned with some of these values. So this is sort of very, again, oversimplification of where organizations are at. But one thing I want to say is that an organization can go from socially aware to being risk adverse to going to detractors. And that can happen, month to month, day by day. These things are very, because there's just so many people within an organization and there are so many decision makers that are at different parts of these organizations, that these things can just kind of oscillate in between. And there is an in between. So you don't have to be just socially aware or just risk adverse. You can be a combination of the two, or you could be in between, or it's more nuanced than just that. So I would love to know, just in the chat, where do you all feel like your organization, if you're comfortable sharing, where do you feel like your organization kind of falls in this sort of continuum or / categories? So I see some are in denial, some are sort of between risk adverse and socially aware, risk adverse. Some might not be comfortable sharing, that's okay. But what performative, active allyship. And what's interesting about this, and what I've sort of got out of doing this exercise for even myself, is asking folks, okay, where do you perceive your organization to be? And then where would you like your organization to be? But then this kind of gives a framework of, where the perceptions are of where of the organization is actually at. So maybe different from how you perceive it to be, and where you would like your organization to go. I think those things are things that you can start working on gaining alignment around. So I see it, some are risk adverse and socially aware, active allyship. I mean, I'm sure the folks that are sort of in the detractor space probably don't want to say it publicly. I get it. But risk adverse, socially aware, I'm seeing a lot of that. Thank you all. Thank you all for your time, and thank you for participating.
Thank you so much, Neelam. Thank you, Tom, for sharing your thoughts. I specialize in recruitment and HR, and so it's really fantastic to have these huge historic economic backgrounds and just organizational models, and I think a lot of that provides some really important context for understanding just how complex these issues are, and I think that can be kind of overwhelming. Where I like to, the zone that I live in and how I like to cope with this, overwhelming information is, organizations are built by people. And like our main stage speakers said today, is that the racism that exists isn't just racist individuals and organizations, it's institutions. But we all, as members of institutions, are the culture creators. And we may have limited positions of power, but we do have positions of influence within our organizations. And the actions that we take can either perpetuate these inequalities within institutions, or we can take every opportunity possible to disrupt those inequalities that we see and try to make a difference, which can make a real difference in our world. So one example of that is, close to home for me is the act of hiring. The act of hiring is really interesting because it is a gatekeeping process of we have 99 applicants and we have to eliminate, we have 100 applicants, we have to eliminate 99 of them. And that can be hard because, some people might see me as a recruiter and my job is to reject people or exclude people. But I think any opportunity like that, like a vacancy in our organization, is an opportunity to really assess, Neelam's models of organizational awareness type. This is a good opportunity for us to think about, where do we fall on this spectrum, and how do we take this opportunity for introspection to determine who we are, who are we missing, where are we going, and how can we disrupt any systems of inequality that we might be perpetuating. And so I'll share my screen and just talk about some of the guiding questions that, let's see, let me get into presentation mode. Thumbs up if y'all can see my screen. Let's see if I can get into presentation mode. Does that look okay? Okay. So often I jump in on search committees or help train people at the university on how to hire. And a lot of the questions are, is how, Dani, how do we hire for diversity? And sometimes that can come from place, just looking at Neelam's models of, sometimes that can come from a performative place, that can come from a denial place. And we have to really assess, who are we as a team or as a department in this process, and how are we going to approach this? Because if we're not careful, if we're being performative or if we're denying, we might be causing a lot of harm to individuals as we go through a process. So I love this illustration. I listened to a podcast and I can't remember the name to give them credit, but if you have heard this too, please shout it out so we can send more people that way. But somebody talked about, specifically in higher education, you walk into a building and there is this wall of white dudes. And that might project, these are very important people who have contributed to the institution, but we need to think about, what signaling are we doing as we're bringing into our organization? And are we signaling that people are welcome here, or are there environmental factors that are excluding people? So guiding questions that I ask departments, because diversity, when we're hiring or we're trying to do inclusion, that can mean something really different, whether we're hiring tenured faculty, whether we're hiring healthcare professionals or accountants or human resource officers. So we'd like to think about, what is our existing culture? What are we missing? Who are we missing? I like to advise teams to think about who are the customers that we serve, and does our team or our group, are we representative of the population that we're trying to serve? Think about what biases do we have, and how do we mitigate those biases during our process? What's our typical pipeline as we're bringing people into the organization? I think this was discussed a lot at the main stage, is that, certain inequalities perpetuate for generations and generations. And we run into these pipelines. I think Dr. Cobb spoke about the struggle that they had finding physics professors. I think was the example, that there were only 3 African-American physics professors, and how can we get more people in? And we need to think about, what's the pipeline to get there? What's the career path to get into this role, and what barriers exist? How can we disrupt that in this process? And how are we setting up the process for a variety of applicants so that they can succeed? And really thinking about possibly letting go of the idea that there is a best applicant, because our systems are designed to support the dominant group and perpetuate the groups that are in power. And if our idea of a best applicant is entrenched in systems that have inequalities, we might be perpetuating inequalities, even though we're treating everyone exactly the same. We have the same standards for everybody. Those standards might be perpetuating inequalities. So those are some questions that I like to ask departments as we think about going into the process. I think that just as we get our arms around just how big these systemic issues are, really focusing on how every single day it's a choice in our department to be inclusive, to create equity in places. And that's not something that's going to happen in a training. We're not all going to leave this Friday forum woke and changing our organizations, but we have to be making these choices every single day. So from there, I think that's all I want to share. I had a couple of slides, but I'm going to stop sharing so that we can open up to discussion. Let's see. There were a couple of questions in there. I saw there was a question earlier from Dimitri that I don't want to get ignored on there. And the question was, can you please talk about what structures are put in place at U of U to investigate cases of ethnic justice and xenophobia? Tom, did you have a response to that, or do you want me to do it?
I don't have a unique response to that. I mean, my advice, if it's an employment matter, would be to encourage people to consult the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity and Affirmative Action. If that's what it is, those sorts of structures that you find at other big institutions, certainly, I think you are very vigorous.
Thank you. That's similar to what I was going to say. Depending on if this is a case that's happening to a student or a faculty member or an employee, it might live in different areas, but I would start with the OEO office, who is there to support you. Pilar, I think I see you have a hand up.
I do. Thank you. I work for the SVP of the Health Sciences, and I am in a position where I lead all leadership searches. So this is a very close to home discussion. Speaking of, as a woman of color and a minority, I have tried to incorporate as much as I can and be a big advocate, because I'm at this level and we're hiring deans and associate vice presidents and chairs. I mean, these are very big positions, national leaders that will influence down the line, correct? And I will say that and we've incorporated UB-IB meeting now in our search process prior to looking at any applicants. so that people are aware of those biases, those unconscious biases that are led by HR. Because we were finding that the word fit and culture were being thrown around, and you can't, those are no longer used in recruiting circles. And so we did start doing that in the search process, and it's helped out at least to make people aware before we give them any CVs and cover letters of, okay, let's take this into account. And then just being a strong advocate when we do have our meetings and we're looking at these CVs for these really prominent positions at the U, to maintain the right dialogue, to maintain the right perspective, having that person in the room that is that arbitrary, you know, I'm ex officio, I don't have voting power, but I can certainly, like you said, influence and make sure that my leaders that are on my search committee maintain the most unbiased picture as we go through these deans and chairs or associate vice presidents, right? I will say that I didn't know how hard of a job it was to get inclusivity and diversity. It's not as easy as it seems, and something that keeps coming up that I talk to Dr. Good about and that I talk to the search firm about is history has to catch up to the present, and there is a huge gap. So as much like Dr. Help me out with the gentleman that was talking today.
Dr. Cobb?
Yes, Dr. Cobb. What I have found is when he was talking about the 3 PhD Black students in physics, right? Well, that's history. That's that big gap that we need to make up for, if you will, that we need to close. And when we're looking at these really high positions, whether it's a dean or a chair of a department, it's hard to watch the numbers and the applicants come in because their history hasn't caught up with the present. We're making baby steps, and systemically and historically, there just isn't the amount of applicants because of what Dr. Cobb said. So, you know, we find them, but we can't birth them. I can't make it I can't bring this ideal candidate, if you will. So we do our very best, but I wanted to share that now that I'm in the inside here, it's harder than it looks, and we do our very best and as a person of color, I really do try and advocate to get a great mix in our candidate pool, but sometimes it's really difficult, you know, but I'm there, we're advocating. So just wanted to let you guys know. Yeah.
Thanks for doing that work, Pilar. I can empathize. It's really, really hard. And, I think that dovetails into some of the other questions that are going through, but yeah, just to speak to what you're saying. I mean, if there's one thing that I hope anybody takes away from any conversation they have with me when they reach out for recruitment help, is that we can't recruit our way into a diverse and inclusive workforce. We're going to cause harm if that's our primary goal. What we have to do is create an inclusive and equitable place for people to succeed in and get there by creating an environment that people are set up to succeed and that they want to exist in. So Mike had a question in the chat. Is HR expanding recruiting programs to help us see more diversity? In IT, we struggle right now getting applicants of any background. I can speak a little bit about some of the work that we've done in HR. I speak for main campus HR, and so the hospital does have a separate talent acquisition team. I can't speak for what they're doing, although I do know that they're doing good work. But things that we've done, we have expanded some of our automatic postings, and so any job that gets posted through our system now pulls on to diversejobs.net. So now that's automatic, and then we've also purchased bulk rates because we have to pay for a lot of external postings, but we do have bulk rates that you can go through HR. So instead of getting a diversity boost on higher education, higheredjobs.com for $175, I've purchased like 300 of them at a time. So we do have discounted rates, and it's $44. So if you work with your friendly HR team, we can help you advertise a little bit more widely. And then HR has also trained all of our reps on how to do evaluations of the voluntary self-identification data. within our application. So every applicant is asked to voluntarily self-identify some demographic data, which is limited. It's not inclusive of everything that diversity might mean in UIT or whatever department that you're in, but we can do a quick evaluation of the overall applicant pool to see if that's representative of the industry or the community that we're in. And then we can also do another evaluation if we do another pass and say, these are the 10 people we want to bring for interview, and we find that we've dropped off and we now have no diversity in our applicant pool. We can advise and recalibrate before we bring people in for interview to make sure that we have a diverse applicant pool.
Can I add something real quick? So when we think about recruitment, and again, I'm not in the academic space, so I don't know entirely how the process works. I used to be, but there's the culture of your organization, and then there's the practice of the organization, and then there's behaviors of the organization. And so you can practice inclusivity, right? You can go through changing language, doing trainings, whatnot, through practice, and you have these policies even that are inclusive. But if the people who are the gatekeepers, your hiring managers, are in behavior just inherently racist or whatever, like, you're not going to get the people that you're aiming to get into the door. And once you do, what's your culture look like? What, I mean, are you, I think Estella had even said on here, you know, are you maybe recruiting, but are you retaining? I think that's a big issue, because a lot of people do spend a lot of time on looking at your pipeline and making sure that you're doing a lot of outreach and you're creating those community relationships. But as folks come into the door, what's the organization truly like? And that's where people miss the mark. I've seen it all the time. And again, it's a perception thing, because a lot of leaders in these organizations believe that their organization is good. They don't want to necessarily, you know, look underneath the rug and say, oh my goodness, there's actually stuff going on that isn't keeping people in the doors or keeping people in the organization. And I think that's where the need is. That's where people need to be looking at, instead of spending all the resources and things in terms of pipeline and recruiting. I do think that you got to get your culture, you got to get your house in order before you bring in more folks. I just think that's really important.
Can I say something to that? Neelam, I think you're completely right. I think I will continue to share my story, because my transition from 43 years living in Southern California to the last 3 years in transitioning to Utah, we're bumpy, and I'll leave it at that. So I think we're making progress at the U, but if anything, that's a space that has huge opportunity to continue to grow and develop, because as a firsthand person, woman at this particular position, coming in from a space where was very culturally different in every aspect of the word, there was a lot of bumps along that road, transitioning into feeling safe and included. So I think if anywhere we are maybe in denial on that spectrum, that continuum that you put on there, I think is the inclusivity. And that's a tough one, because you do feel like odd man out when you're the only one in that space. And prior to George Floyd, you did not have a platform or a safety net that you thought could hold you. And so now that there is that platform, there is still trepidation to step forward. So I will just reiterate the website that Phyllis Vetter put on the chat, because it's a great space to be able to do that. And she's our head, she's our main lawyer. So I love Phyllis, hello. But so that's a great resource there, because I know that there's others like me that have that bumpy road to transition. Yeah, so we'll get there.
I got somebody sent me a direct message of a question, so I'll read it out loud, but I won't say their name. I don't know if they would prefer not to be known, but what advice would you give to those of us who work in recruiting in our areas and are met with resistance to advertise in diverse publications in the HBCUs because nobody looks at postings? Hiring is all done by word of mouth. We always just hire somebody we know. Maybe my panelists like to take a first crack at that before I run away with it.
Well, I would, just as somebody who's been involved in a lot of faculty recruiting, I mean, I think that I expect that faculty recruiting and that things that within a university in particular present, you would hope, a fertile ground for doing this, but also some real challenges in the sense that the cultures that matter are probably the cultures of the disciplines. So the culture in sociology is different from the culture in economics, and it's different from the culture in language and literature or whatever. And so there's all these different sort of areas in which one has to find a way to kind of make the case and move the project along. But this point about recruiting takes place through word of mouth and not so much through the formal mechanisms, I think is very true of at least some parts of academia. And that's just historically, that's a big problem. I mean, if, on the one hand, you might say, well, recruiting through my well-known colleagues is good because then I can trust them and I know who it is they're bringing to me. But it just perpetuates sort of whatever historical stratification is in place. I mean, helps to perpetuate it. So it's a really big problem. I think, in our case in economics, I'm pleased that these postings are done automatically now, and because we might not know kind of where to look outside of in economics. There's like one website. It's called Job Openings for Economists, and that's where it all happens. But to have other places to go is, I think, very helpful, and I think we find that useful. But there is a lot of inertia, certainly in faculty recruiting.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, so recruiting, through referrals or word of mouth is a really outdated way of recruiting. So any organization that wants to be sort of cutting edge and up to date will probably not have that be their main source of recruiting. There's, with the fact that we can access social media so quickly and we have access to people, the excuse that my circle's small or that I just don't know, that is an excuse. I would have to say, and that's what I tell organizations that too. I just say, look, you have to think outside the box when you think about your recruitment strategies. If you're just using that sort of method that everybody has used in the past, you're just gonna continue to do the same cycle of hiring the same people that look and think and act like you. I mean, that you're just not breaking that cycle. I would say that my argument to people, to leaders who are just like, we're going to hire from the same sources that we've always continuously hired from. My argument would be, okay, then you clearly don't want to move forward as an organization. You clearly don't want to grow as an organization. You're kind of just stuck in that place as other organizations are moving forward. And I think that kind of puts a fire under leaders that need to make that decision to say, okay, we do need to think outside the box. We need to be a little bit more proactive and a little bit more innovative in the way we recruit if we want to be an organization that's moving forward. And I hate that has to be the motivating factor, but sometimes that is the motivating factor.
Yeah, I agree. Another motivating factor can be that, I hate that this is a motivating factor, but publishing in diverse publications, even if leadership doesn't think that it's effective, it's a metric and it's a paper trail. And I hate that that's a motivating factor, but I think whatever gets these jobs out in front of people, but we need to be aware now more than ever that there is not one traditional pipeline into any position. There's many ways to get to the same destination and or a similar destination. And it doesn't mean that we're lowering our standards at all. It means that we're broadening our pool and we're broadening the possibilities of who we can bring into our fold. But if we have this, limited idea of doing things the way that they've always been done, or hiring people who have followed the same career path as me, or hiring people who know the same people that we know. We're just going to get more of the same. And that is going to ultimately hurt our business, whatever that business is. I'm just scrolling through the chat for any questions. Is there anything I'm missing as I'm going through here? I think there was one more. How is U able to effectively implement EDI if they've done so at each department, more so at student services like Center for Student Affairs and at academic departments? I think my initial response, and panelists, please jump in, or any participants if you have thoughts or comments. It's big. It's hard to implement EDI, and it's a journey. There's never going to be a time where balloons drop from the ceiling and we did it. We implemented all of EDI. So it's something that has to be done. It can't be done just by HR saying, okay, now we're posting on diversejobs.net. It can't be done by EDI saying like, hey, you're all going to take this workshop. It needs to be done by getting everyone on board and everybody thinking about EDI all of the time. And so we're getting there. We've got participants in this program. We've got people who are coming to these Friday forums, but it does have to be, people need to buy into it at every department and set up their own accountability methods in there. I'm curious to see what my panelists think about what needs to be done, or how we're going to be able to effectively implement these EDI practices.
I would just say briefly, this will sound like a cop-out, but at the faculty level, in a department like mine, we have 20 right now, tenure line faculty. We get to hire a tenure line faculty member maybe once a year, maybe every other year, and so altering the composition of one's faculty under those conditions, it simply can't occur rapidly, unfortunately. One thing I think that means is it requires a commitment at the top of the institution to provide funding to expand departments or facilitate new hires that can make that happen. So I'm a little bit more optimistic at the student level in the sense that it's a much larger population, a higher churn kind of thing. And economics in general is a very male discipline relative to the other social sciences. And there's a lot of effort now within the discipline to change that and to alter the gender composition. And there are projects going on, including here in our department, to try to make that happen. And so I think that's sort of a more fruitful venue in a way, because there's just more, you're encountering more people, there's more opportunity for changing things more rapidly. It's still a lot of work.
Dani, so I work at the Office of the Commissioner, but we, all of our HR stuff and everything goes through the U, including our performance evaluation system. And one of the things I was really pleased to see when we were setting up our performance evaluations for this next year, at least from what I can tell from the manager side, is that the first, I'm going to say page, the first screen or whatever where you set things has on there, like it asks about, there's a safety question, and then it asks, I think it's safety, and then it has a like the one you, I'm going to say stuff. I'm still learning the pieces, but I was really excited because I'd already talked to my team about saying, I want everybody to have something related to EDI in your performance, like as we're talking about what you're going to do, whether that's you're going to do professional development or some of the work you're going to do is going to, lead to some of these things. And so I was like, oh, great, there's a really nice place to measure that, right, plugged in there. And so I was pleased to see that, because I think unless you measure something, you have to measure it to show that it's valuable.
Thank you. I'm so excited to see that you noticed that, Laura. Yes, that's part of our performance management tied to the institutional goals of the university. And so if we do look at the institutional goals of the university that were set out by the president's office, EDI is one of those top priorities. Additionally, tools that we've done within the HR department is we've added an EDI professional development component that is a requirement on our department specific performance evaluation. So every member of our team, we've made a decision as a team to add that on, provide professional development opportunities, provide space for people to do that. So that is something that every department, every manager could do for their own team also, which is a great way as a team to determine what does this mean for our team, and make it specific to us, but also a great measure of accountability.
It's a great point, Dani. I post in the chat that the only way to disseminate these EDI ideas to department is from department to delegate a person to represent and disseminate information from EDI to the department. And also, like any complaints, anything else on department would be looked at by this person. And from medicine standpoint, the best person would probably be chief resident. It's just an extra activity. But I think this is the only way to make sure it's spread to the local level from the centralized is just through department initiative to delegate a person to EDI meetings and be responsible for the dissemination of information and dissemination of the ideas.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. We still have some time left on this. Are there any other questions or thoughts, or my co-panelists, do you have anything that you'd like to share with the group?
Looks like we have Monica who just raised their hand.
Oh,
I was just going to share that, you know, the EDI office does have their town hall posted from last year, and in the town hall, you can go back and rewatch that. It does talk about the recommendations for colleges and department units for implementing EDI. I took a screenshot of this, one of the slides they shared, which talked about that. I could share that with you if you let me share my screen real quick.
sure, just a second.
And so this was the image that I took, and I'll, if I can find the link, I'll share it with you. I just couldn't find it right off the bat, the link to the town hall, but at the time when I watched it, I took this screenshot, and the presenter, you know, did talk about the strategy 2025 of the university, and here are the things that the departments and colleges should be doing to help implement EDI goals within their units. And so I don't know if this is helpful. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much, Monica. This is very helpful. Apologies, I'm just catching up with the chat. Any other questions or thoughts?
This is Mike Eckstrom. I was the one that posted the question about hiring assistants and everything. And I think I really appreciated Neelam's comments that if you're recruiting and hiring in the old way, you're never going to improve. And we've really struggled to get even applicants, period, right? I mean, it's right now. I mean, I was so pleased to hear, Dani, that you have HR posting out to these more diverse websites and locations. I wasn't even aware of that initiative, so that's fantastic. But it's just, I mean, we've opened probably 10 IT positions in the last months, and we're lucky to get 5 applicants, and most of them are not diverse, right? I will say though that because we have I don't know if it's a reputation or whatnot of being very embracive. We embrace the LGBTQ plus community a lot. We do tend to get some from that community applying, but we don't see, it's kind of like, word of mouth still seems to get people to apply, right? Even though it's not the right way to do it. It's the way that somehow, if our transgender employees send out messages to their community, hey, I'm really taken care of here, I love working here, then we get more transgender applicants, right? But it's one of those things where we seem to be struggling to get the true representation of diversity. We don't get a lot of African American applicants. We don't get, it's just, I really look forward to partnering with HR to find ways to get the message out, to get people wanting to apply. We want to embrace everyone, and I would be heartbroken to think that somebody applied to my organization and didn't get interviewed just because of some external factor, right? It should only matter what they can do and what their qualifications are. And I'm just, it's really, when you only have an applicant pool of 5 people, it's really easy for me to see if my managers are selecting on any bias, right? Because that's a small pool. It's pretty visible what's there. And so anything you can do to guide us and help us to expand that and move the bar, we're ready to jump on board.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, it's challenging, especially just given the economic factors right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of a great resignation, and everyone is really hurting for applicants. And so there are some strategies, like you mentioned, thinking about outreach when it comes to getting this job in front of as many people as possible, targeting specific groups, and also signaling every step of the way within the job description, the advertisement, that we are a safe place to work for people. But yeah, I could talk about that all day, and maybe we schedule something offline to dig into specific strategies for specific positions. I know we have only a few minutes. I see Pamela has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say the whole concept that we talked about this Friday forums was, leading with equity. And so equity may cause us to have to overcompensate for what we have been doing because, in the past, maybe we have under-delivered. Obviously, we've under-delivered. And so I just, I was trying to figure out how to formulate that into a question. I know a lot of people are, concerned when you say things like that, but that's really what leading with equity causes us to have to be able to do, as look at what we've been doing in the past and how do we need to overcompensate? How do we get to those, looking for those diverse places to advertise for diverse candidates? How do we go out of our comfort zone and, whether it's networking with different organizations, for example, there's the Black Chamber of Commerce, there's the Asian Chamber of Commerce, the Latinx Chamber of Commerce. How do we get out of our own comfort cells so that we can overcompensate? Because it's going to take overcompensation just to get to some level of equity and equality. So.
And I think just to add to that overcompensation, it's kind of also thinking about people that you need to get rid of within the organization to make space for others. So if there are people that are problematic within the organization that are causing toxic workplace environment, they may need to go. Because again, you're thinking about equity, right? And so this idea of overcompensating, I love that, Pamela, is if you're doing that, you're also going to need to look at the people you've hired already that may have been barriers to creating a more equitable workplace as well. So not only think outside of the box about who you're going to hire, but think outside of the box of who you're going to fire as well. And I know people don't like to say that. I can say that, and I say it very bluntly to people, that you can't keep toxic people in your workplace and then expect to invite more folks in. You may need to reevaluate that as well, the stuff that you have on hand.
I think building off of Neelam's point, you know, how much weight are we going to give to commitment to values of EDI within our organization, and saying this is our department's values, this is our organization's values. And even if you are a top performer in the organization, if you are an obstacle to those values of our organizations, then you're not doing your job correctly. So I think that is a good point. And also just think about how much are we going to weigh EDI values in our recruitment process. If we see over and over again, people, you know, say diversity is important in the recruitment process, but then they give weight to institutional knowledge or, you know, prestige of the educational institution that they went to, and things that might provide barriers to people. So really just thinking about how are we going to weigh all these values in a way that, you know, overcompensates and helps bring equity to the forefront of our organizations. I know we're just over time. I can see people are dropping off. Thank you so much to everyone who participated. Thank you to our co-panelists. Co-panelists, do you have any final gems of knowledge, final thoughts you want to share with our group?
No, used up all my gems of knowledge. Oops. Used up all my gems of knowledge, and I can't even get my microphone on. It's been great. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you all for participating and for your questions and for your discussion. I thoroughly have appreciated it. Thank you.